Good morning, everyone. My name is Noxolo Ndaga, and I am the project manager for the Democracy Works Academy. I'd like to welcome everyone who has joined us this morning for the intergenerational dialogue discussions for this week. And we are really excited to have this and to ensure that our participants are able to interact and also share their experiences and also have cross-generational experiences around some of these conversations. So to begin, our facilitator for today is Dr. Sithembile Mbete, who I'm going to introduce before we introduce our speaker. Dr. Sithembile Mbete is a lecturer in the Department of Political Sciences at the University of Pretoria, where she lectures international relations and South African politics. She's also an associate fellow of the Center for Governance Innovation at the University of Pretoria, and holds a doctorate from UP on the subject of South Africa's foreign policy during its 2 elected terms in the United Nations Security Council. She has published on the EFF on the economic freedom fighters in accredited journals. Her research has been funded by the National Institute for Humanities and Social Science, the National Research Foundation, and the American Science Research Council and the Mellon Foundation. She has commented frequently in the media on a range of issues in South African politics and international politics. She has appeared in local and international media, including ENCA, SABC, Kaya FM, the BBC, and The Guardian, and the Financial Times, and the New York Times. Dr. Mbete, thank you so much for coming on board as a facilitator. I will just hand over to you, who she will introduce our speaker.
Sorry, it seems as if she dropped off. I think due to the power outages, we're having some connection issues, but she is joining.
Okay. We'll just give her a few minutes. Hi, Sithembile. I was just introducing you to the participants, and I'm just going to hand over to you to introduce our first speaker for today.
Fantastic. Morning, everyone. It's so lovely to be here with all of you again. Hi to all of the participants. I am so glad to be part of this residential seminar with you again, and very excited to be facilitating this conversation, this intergenerational dialogue that we're going to be having this week. That's going to allow you to ask the questions that you were asked and all together to the people that were involved in some of the decision making, which I think will be really great. And I think that having this opportunity to share experiences and thoughts across generations is such an important one that's provided by our program. And we have none better us this morning, and he is someone who was very involved in the formation of post-apartheid South Africa. Mohammed is a former member of parliament. He's a qualified attorney and an experienced negotiator. He was part of the ANC team at the Convention for a Democratic South Africa at CODESA, and later part of the agreements on the final South African Constitution. In 1994, he was appointed as a senator in the first Democratic Parliament, and he chaired the Select Committee on Constitutional Affairs. In 2001, he was appointed as a provincial minister of local government. He was MEC of local government in Mpumalanga. He has acted in an advisory capacity to several ministers since he left public office in 2004. And is presently an advisor to the Minister of Cooperative Government and Traditional Affairs. Mohammed has worked on transitional and constitutional support projects in Kenya, South Sudan, Madagascar, Sri Lanka, Yemen, Palestine, Bahrain, and as so he is someone with a great deal of experience both in managing South Africa's post-conflict situation. Remember when we last spoke and I said that we don't talk enough about the South African settlement as a post-conflict negotiation. And he's also got that same experience working in a number of other places as well. So, Mohammed, I'd like to hand over to you. Thank you so much for joining us this morning, and we'll hand over to you to give your remarks.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Doctor? Yeah, is it clear? Okay.
Yes, I can hear you. Yeah.
And the video is clear as well.
Perfectly.
Good. All right, we can start. Thanks, Doctor. Thanks for the introduction. And a year is already passed. Can you believe it? But we are now in surreal times. Who would have thought 6 months ago that we would be in the situation that we are in? An event, one little virus that's going to change the world, and that is changing the world. But firstly, it's a privilege to be invited by Democracy Works, and I think you focus on what is perhaps the most important part of a democracy, that's active citizenry and an informed citizenry that holds politicians account. Many of you may not have been around 1990, 1985, 1986, 87, or if you were around, you may have been privy to a number of stories that your parents would have told you, your elders have told you, anecdotes about what life was all about and how events unfolded. It was between 95 and 94. It was an exciting time, it was a dangerous time, but also a romantic and a hopeful time. And I'm sure as you sit here, you see events unfold in your life. You find that some things are going wrong, some things are going right. And you look back in retrospect and you may have certain views, even as judgment. Some say that we gave away too much. Some say we gave away too little. Some say we sold out. And you're entitled to your opinion, but I'd like to give you a context under which certain decisions were taken. We'll all agree that South Africa is an emotional roller coaster. Living in this country, you never have a dull moment. Now we have the scandal around the COVID masks. That, I'm sure Dr. CODESA, Jane Naidu will be much more frank than I am and much more honest. My terms of reference are purely to tell you about CODESA. On Wednesday, Rolf Meyer will be speaking to you from the perspective of our adversary, the Nationalist Party. Needless to say that it's a typical South African story that both of us have become friends after being very, very vicious enemies. And it's the story of South Africa, which still resonates around the world. Rolf and I go around the world in areas of conflict, and it is this model that was used to unlock the conflict in Northern Ireland. So let's go into what makes our model so appealing around the world, and what is it that we succeeded with, and how is it that we approached the challenges of the day. Give you a context. We must tell you that the negotiations did not take place in a vacuum. There were events around the world that influenced us. The first thing that comes to mind is the falling of the Berlin Wall. Now, why would a wall some 7,000 or 12,000 kilometers away have an impact on us? Before the falling of the Berlin Wall, there were two superpowers in this world. One was the Soviet Union and the other United States of America. After the Berlin Wall had fallen, we started living in a unipolar world where there was only one international power. And it had an impact on us. Around us, we saw Mozambique fall. The colonial powers had to leave. Angola, Southwest Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, and this took place throughout Africa. What the fall of the Berlin Wall did was, one of our biggest benefactors from the liberation movement side was the Soviet Union. And suddenly the umbilical cord was cut. And I must confess that it did in some way exert pressure on us, because suddenly we could not rely on world power to provide us arms, to provide us moral support, even at the United Nations. It was confronting its own problems. It did leave us a bit exposed. Then the other issue was that the Nationalist Party and the South African government had become pariahs in the world. The liberation forces had taken the challenge to apartheid at three levels. One was at the diplomatic level. The other was through internal mobility. So we had the UDF and we had citizens participating in the overthrow of apartheid. And the third was at the diplomatic level. The military, diplomatic, and civic or civil unrest was the three-pronged attack we had. The nationalist government had realized that apartheid was not sustainable anymore. So what we had was a situation where you had two powers negotiating with each other and having to confront a problem, and yet both powers were not capable of defeating each other. And let me elaborate on this. The first was that while the South African government had perhaps one of the most well-equipped militaries in the world, the difficulty was, as in the case of the rest of Africa, the colonial powers had a mother country to go back to. In Zimbabwe, the British or the white Zimbabweans could go back to Britain. In Portugal, in Mozambique, they could go back to Portugal. And however, in South Africa, our oppressors had become pariahs in the world. They did not have a motherland to go back to. And we call this a colonization of a special type. So as the ANC and as the liberation forces, we realized that whatever negotiated settlement we had, our enemy is going to continue living with us. And this enemy had perhaps one of the most powerful military in the world. It had the civil service on its side, and also it had political power. It was in that context that we went to negotiate with them. On our side, the apartheid government had realized that apartheid was not sustainable anymore. It did not have the capacity to quell the civil unrest within South Africa, and South Africa was on a negative path growth. So here you had two adversaries who were unable to defeat each other, and they had to sit and talk. We knew that our enemy is going to be within. Now we had two options. One is to go into a civil war, and we know the consequences of a civil war. The other was to get a settlement. The extent of the settlement was also being influenced by world events. We entered the negotiations on the following basis, with the following understanding, that the most important thing we needed to preserve and to try and maintain was the notion of a state. The apartheid government was extremely ingenious in dividing South Africa on an ethnic basis. It wanted to rule, the minority wanted to rule by making the ethnic identity of every South African the primary identity. Our role was to make and develop a South African identity. And we can debate whether we achieved this, but in my view, the greatest achievement of CODESA was we were able to establish a South African identity. Let me give you examples of what happens when you don't have a national identity, or what we call the notion of a state. In Libya, Gaddafi was removed, and that country has plunged into a civil war based on ethnic violence. In Iraq, you have a Sunni-Shia divide after Saddam Hussein was removed. In Syria, the same thing. We are beginning to see what the consequences are if people don't have an allegiance to a country. And so our greatest challenge was to create the notion of a state. Our challenge was that the genius of apartheid was to ensure that people are divided on their ethnicity, and they did this through a system of patronage. If you believe that this is a theoretical exercise, then all you have to see is Eastern Cape, look at KwaNdebele, and you will also see how spatial apartheid in our cities are developed. It is about the only country in the world where the poorest live furthest away from the city center. We criticize the taxi drivers, we criticize the taxis for the way they behave, but the truth is that they mobilize over 2, 3, 4 million people a day in South Africa, in Johannesburg alone. But the difficulty is that the poorest live furthest away. And when apartheid ended, the poor moved to the city center and the infrastructure couldn't hold. So Hillbrow is a consequence of that. These were some of the things. The other thing that we had to realize was that apartheid was built on a system, its geography, its infrastructure was built on a system where only black males were needed for their labor and not their education. So the entire infrastructure of a city was based on that. You find El Dorado Park, you find Soweto, you find Lenasia furthest away from the city center. And at 9 o'clock, there used to be a curfew, an alarm used to sound, and black people had to vacate the streets. They would be arrested if they were in the streets. And it is against this challenge and this history that we had to negotiate a settlement. Apart from that, from a psychological level, if you are told all your life when you grow up from school age that the black man is not a human being, the black man is a person who has only sexual impulses and their only desire is to rape and sleep with white women. This is what people were told, and there were biblical references made to this. This was the psychology of our adversary, and we had to go into a negotiation. On top of it, that enemy was going to live with us. So when I say to you that perhaps our greatest achievement is for all our differences, for all our weaknesses, and for all of the conflicts we have, what we do have, whether it is at a soccer stadium, at a rugby stadium, or a cricket stadium, there is a patriotism to a single country. And again, I say, I mean, I was sitting at the opening of the World Cup, and next to me was a Muslim woman sitting in her niqab, fully covered, but with the South African flag. And I said, if I could witness that, then perhaps we have achieved something, because her identity is truly South African. And that is what I say in the notion of a state. So what we've managed to do, and what we had to do at the time, was elevate your South African identity above your ethnic identity. And that is, let me not belabor the point. Then what else happened was we had 9 homelands and four administrations: Transvaal, Free State, Western, Cape, and which was the other one. Anyway, the point is there were 9 homelands, each one existing out of a system of patronage. We had to bring them into a system and bring them into the discussions. And this is where Nelson Mandela showed his leadership. He says, if you want a solution, it must be as inclusive as possible. We learned from the IRA in Ireland that only 10% of a population that is not included can wreak havoc in a country. And that country has seen it. So what he decided was that we must have the most inclusive system we can have, no matter how small your enemy is and no matter how hated the enemy is. And CODESA was then born. And at CODESA, you had people with one briefcase and a fax machine, and they called themselves a political party. But Nelson Mandela said, bring them in. Because if we get a settlement, it must be a contribution from each of these parties, and they will own the settlement. Of course, we were not happy to to negotiate. We were young, we were angry, we were passionate. We were not happy to speak to the enemy. But the alternatives were too ghastly to contemplate. A civil war. The other difficulty, and we see this in Egypt, we see this in a number of countries. Zimbabwe is a country we're seeing north of us. If the military did not come under political management and they existed as an entity on their own, we were in trouble. And we saw signs of it. At CODESA, while we were talking, thousands, in fact, more people died between 1990 and 1994 than before Nelson Mandela was released. Thousands, literally thousands, were killed. Some of us accused the Nationalist Party government. Some say that they had lost control over the generals. But the generals wanted to go their own way. They didn't want to accept a settlement. Again, we had to reach out to the generals and say that you have a vested interest in this. And fortunately, they saw the light. And there is this famous photograph which we are criticized for, and some of us say that it's a wonderful photograph. At the inauguration of Nelson Mandela, you saw the head of the military, who was the head of the military under apartheid, was now the head of the military in a new democratic South Africa. The fact that he was prepared to serve in a democratic order was a miracle on its own, because we could not have a recalcitrant military. They would have destroyed us, and they would have destroyed the democracy. But they came under political management. The other lesson we learned, and if I could share this with you, is that your enemy is not homogeneous. There are elements in your enemy and your adversary who are more reasonable than others. We define them and distinguish them as the doves and the hawks. The doves were those that saw the light, were pragmatic at the very least. Some of them made a conscious change and said that apartheid is a crime against humanity. It appealed to their conscience. Once we overcame their fear, all their lives they were told to fear Chris Hani because he was a communist, Joe Slovo is a communist, and these are terrorists. But once we addressed their fear, and they spoke to us on a person-to-person basis over a cup of tea, they realized that the people that they've been dehumanizing all their lives have the same fears as them, have the same aspirations. They worried about their children. Likewise, we hated our enemy. But what we also realized, that underpinning their actions were real fears. It was based on a very Calvinistic, nationalistic flavor. They themselves had suffered at the hands of the British, and they didn't want a replication of the same. But the reason why I highlight this is because once we got inclusivity, we got ownership, and after that came trust. And we started trusting people, and they started trusting us. And it is on that basis that we were able to get agreements. But to come back to the point of when you negotiate, try and negotiate by being observant of who the doves are and who the hawks are. Reach out to doves, and by reaching out to the doves, you are able to strengthen a center, which will enable you to create a momentum so that you get a settlement. Now, the second, I said the first element of a successful democracy is the notion of a state. The second are accountable institutions. We had realized, and boy were we correct, because if you see what's going on now, we realized that for a democracy to exist and for a democracy to succeed, we needed accountable institutions. Now, if you want to do an analysis of whether we have established accountable institutions, in the last, since 1994, 2 presidents have been removed from office. But guess what? The next day people went to work. There were no guns in the street. There were no tanks in the street. And I look at that for an emerging democracy coming from Africa, knowing the history of South America, Africa, and some Arab countries. I think it's a huge source of pride that life could go on and we were able to settle our differences in the institutions of democracy. And what are the institutions of democracy? If you recall, the last president was removed because of a report from Mandela, that was the public protector, and that report was then adjudicated upon by the Constitutional Court as led by Justice Mohammed, and it is upon those pronouncements that a president was removed. If we could settle our differences, the conflicts in our democratic institutions, then we have gone somewhere. And despite all the negativity, we have removed 2 presidents, we have removed a commissioner of police. These were celebrated people of the struggle. Yet life goes on and lives have not been lost because of political conflict. And it's something we can use as a measurement of whether our institutions are strong enough. Of course, presidents, and I can be quite frank about it. The previous president tried to temper with the legitimacy of those systems of accountability. But you needed a brave woman like Thuli Madonsela who said enough is enough. Justice Mohammed said, I'm going to protect this judicial institution and you're not above the law. And guess what? We've had a peaceful election. So amidst all the gloom sometimes we see, there are certain things that work. I want to just relate to you that when you switch on CNN and you watch some of the we're leading up to the American elections, this is exactly what Donald Trump is doing. He is busy compromising the institutions of democracy, appointing his kind of people on the judiciary. And that's exactly, so heaven forbid if he wins, we're in trouble. But if he doesn't win, the task for the next administration in the United States is going to be exactly the same thing that we're going through, to re-establish the legitimacy of the institutions because they were compromised. But let me come back to another issue. I think the third thing for a successful democracy is the rule of law. Now here we have challenges. We did negotiate within the context of a rule of law. Although they were apartheid laws, in the context of that law, during the transition between 1994 and 1996, first of all, leading up to 1994, we needed an independent electoral commission. Yes, it was headed by Justice Kriegler. Many of us said, I mean, this guy is illegitimate. How can he serve in the apartheid government? But the truth is he delivered a free and fair election. That was his commitment to democracy, regardless of where he served. But the rule of law is where I think we are beginning to struggle. And while the rule of law helped us and the negotiations did not take place in an environment of anarchy, yes, people died. But by and large, we have produced 6 or 7 general elections that were free and fair. And particularly in 1994, with all the tensions, fortunately, we did not allow anarchy. Even the law at that time was not transformed leading up to 1994. Many of the laws were still dictated by the apartheid laws. But to the extent where it helped us usher in a democracy, I think it did work out. If the peacefulness in which the 94 election took place, perhaps that is an indicator. But here is my difficulty, because next to the rule of law is the ability to administration. And the difficulty is that in advanced democracies, administrations are apolitical. They do not serve the political interests, they serve the people. And unfortunately, as an emerging democracy in a post-revolutionary country, we have an administration that is still too politically charged. And the allegiance is often not to the country, but to a political party. And that's where we are struggling. How we address that is going to require a mind shift of seismic proportions. Yes, there are indications that it's happening, but we're very far from that. But that, I suppose, Dr. Khoza and Jay Naidu and them will address later. I want to also highlight one further thing. Why do we have 9 provinces? That's a question you must be asking yourself. We entered the negotiations on the basis of a unitary state. We said apartheid divided us. We don't want provinces. When we negotiated, the Nationalist Party wanted 13 provinces, the 4 existing provinces that were under them, the administrations, the Transvaal Provincial, Free State, Cape administration, and they wanted to add the 9 homelands, thinking that the homelands would align to them, because through a system of patronage, Mangope, Brigadier Khoza and all of them were benefiting from the apartheid system. But again, it was the Mandela personality, and he managed to convince, except Mangope, and at some stage KwaZulu-Natal as well, he managed to convince them that come into the process and we will be able to address many of the concerns, because the homelands do not have any industries. And you'll see till today, the provinces that struggle the most, Eastern Cape, Mpumalanga to some extent, and Limpopo, are the provinces that had the most homelands before 94. And the reason is because they had to integrate different administrations. And those administrations had a different culture altogether. So they're still struggling. But the point is that the Nationalist Party wanted 14 provinces, hoping that they could, knowing that the ANC would win the popular vote, but they will be able to stifle them in the Senate, because the Senate had an equal number of representatives, regardless of the size of the population of a province. And that, they started on that pretext, and we finally settled on 9 provinces. Even with 9 provinces, they were hoping to win the Western Cape, Eastern Cape, Northern Cape, and they thought that they would hold the balance of power in the Senate. Of course, after 96, the final constitution, there was no Senate. We called it the National Council of Provinces. So it was a political move. It was under the guise of a unitary federal debate. The ANC wanted a unitary. They said the system divided us completely. In retrospect, I am not so vehemently opposed or for a unitary state right now. And I'll tell you why. Each of the provinces have allowed for regional ethnic expression, but within a South African context. So there is a way of letting off steam. How the administration, I think we are over-engineered. I think we have too many provinces, but that's a different argument. Let me leave you with, I suppose we'll have a lot of discussion when we talk, but let me leave you with 1 or 2 thoughts. I went on a course recently, and it sort of crystallized and mobilized what I'm thinking. The question you've got to ask yourself is, Rolf and I and ITI are asked to do mediation and facilitation around the world, even now. And when I tell you that there are reasons to be proudly South African, our motto, and I'm telling you, Palestine, Myanmar, Cuba, Sri Lanka, Madagascar, we are working there. What is the appeal? Why is the South African model so appealing? And the reason is I learned very recently on a course that the way we approach things are rooted in African tradition. We, African people and communal societies, never ever negotiated and discussed in a way where you had a victor or a vanquished. You had a way of addressing things where there was value for everybody and interest for everybody. It never looked back, it looked forward for solutions. And we must all remember, sometimes we are very angry, and when I sit in negotiations, I have to remain impartial, but I clearly am, psychologically, I side with one side. But reconciliation and justice is not the same thing. Sometimes, and I know unfortunately that's the nature of life, sometimes we have to compromise justice for broader objective, and that's peace. Let me end off with one thing. We're seeing what's going on in India. There is a nationalist movement, and there is a lot of conflict taking place. There were Muslim rulers in India, many of whom were very cruel. And now in a democratic India, there are nationalists who want blood for the past. Of course, they do it for political reasons. What is it that happens there, is going on there, that did not, why is it not happening here in South Africa to the extent that they are nationalists? And I think Yasmin Suka will be able to speak to you about that, that we were able to address our past through the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. India has not come to terms with its past. We did not have that process. We were able to come to terms with all the pain, with all the anguish. We were able to confront our past. The Germans, in many ways, did address it after 1945. Chile has addressed it. And you begin to see a pattern that the more you address your past and come to terms with it, the less space you give to nationalists and the less space you give for hatred. So Yasmin would discuss that. And I just want to say to you that, end off by saying the following, that yes, South Africa is an emotional roller, but we are also a young country. Compare us with emerging democracies. When I see Nokolo, when I see Dr. Mbete, I hope I'm not being patronizing, but it's a huge sense of pride, because the greatest damage done to black people in this country is that it destroyed the education system. And despite all the difficulties with Dr. Mbete emerging, we have Nokolo emerging. We have a number of people emerging whom we look up to with a great sense of pride. And I'm saying that again, I'm not trying to be romantic or optimistic. Look in the context of where we are, look in the context in the world, and make comparisons and say, ask the question, why does the world still marvel at our negotiated settlement? I end off on that talk, and then we can have a chat. Or have I spoken too little, or do you want me to speak more?
Well, I am going to, thank you so much for that. I'm going to abuse my role as the chair and ask you a couple of questions before we then go for a break, and then we'll allow the participants after we come back from the break to engage with what you've said. Thank you so much for that address, and also for the reminder about how remarkable it is that South Africa still exists in this form. I think I may have shared this in our last session together with the fellows, but last year I had a delegation from the Canadian Foreign Ministry come. Oh, they were from the research department of their foreign ministry and were in Pretoria for a number of things. And so the head of that delegation asked for us to meet. And so I met with him, and he said to me, he had been, it was his first time in South Africa, but in 1981, when he started in the foreign ministry as a young diplomat, he had been on a research team that was developing scenarios for Southern Africa, and basically trying to predict what would happen in Southern Africa and what the impact would be for Canada and Canadian foreign policy and sort of global politics. And he says South Africa was going to be the basket case in 1981 when they were projecting at what, it was a 20-year projection of what Southern Africa was going to look like, and South Africa was going to be stuck in an intractable civil war. Zimbabwe was going to be a great success and was going to be the richest country in the region. Namibia was Southwest Africa, Namibia didn't exist then, was going to be stuck in this proxy war, in a war also that was going to be raging in South Africa and would have raged, they imagine, for about 10 to 15 years by the year 2000. And so he was saying to me that just off that experience as a young man, how remarkable it seemed to him that he'd come to a country that wasn't on fire. And I think that, Mohammed, you've really brought that home in terms of shaping and explaining to us some of the context of the CODESA negotiations, I think particularly the international context. And I want to highlight a number of things that you've said and kind of probe them a bit more. The idea of creating a single state and a national identity was the most important thing. And I think that for many young people who didn't grow up in a context of the separation of people in terms of ethnicity the way that we were, that seems obvious, right? So I think that the importance of highlighting that creating a single South Africa that people would feel allegiance to and not feel allegiance to Bophuthatswana or to Natal province was a really big deal, and that we achieved that, I think, is significant. I think the second thing you've highlighted is this idea of living with the enemy, and the enemy not being homogenous, that this wasn't a war that you fought and then you could expel the people. I mean, it's also very different to what happened in Germany, right? The Germans murdered 98% of the Jewish population during the Holocaust in Germany. And so even the reconciliation that was happening in Germany, and yes, they've owned up very significantly to their past, but it's also about apologizing to a population that no longer exists there. Whereas the South African situation is pretty unique in having people that were at war with each other now having to live with each other in some kind of constructive way. And then this idea about having succeeded at the rule of law but failed at administration. And that's the question I want to ask you, is what went wrong in that respect around thinking through the administrative aspects of governance? What we hear often is that the ANC just wasn't ready to govern, so it was just completely incapable of knowing what needed to be done. Is that it? I'd like to hear your thoughts about what you think has gone wrong in terms of the administrative aspects of governance in South Africa.
Doctor, you said you're going to abuse me. Let me say this is gross abuse, because you're going to ask me to be extremely, extremely frank, but I am going to be frank with you. Please don't see my answer as a rationalization, and also don't see it as an explanation, please. There's a very big difference, Doctor. So you firstly have to integrate 9 administrations. Okay, I was an MC in Mpumalanga. Now, I'm trying to give you a context to this. We take over power. And I must tell you that the apartheid system, as far as its service to the white community, was perhaps one of the best in the world. Malaysia and some of the Nordic countries were very good at that. What happened was, picture the scene. We have a lot of comrades coming back, right? Many of them, most of them can't be accommodated politically. And I'm being very frank. Yes, we had to compromise meritocracy for a while. But I don't want to, you see, the reason why I'm saying this very carefully, Doctor, because I don't want you to accuse me of saying that by introducing people of color, we're compromising meritocracy or merit. That's not what I'm saying. I am saying there was political pressure on us. We could not have assumed, as it is, there was an economic transfer of power. It's one of my biggest regrets. Whether we had the space to do it, I don't know. I don't know. Maybe I'm wiser after the fact, but I'm not certain. My personal view is we could have pushed the envelope a little more. Yeah. But I say this in the context that 90 million rand was left on the 26th of April 1994 from one little suburb in Gauteng. That's how much money was leaving this country because they feared a black government. And perhaps we were weak in that regard. I don't know. You know what, history will judge us. But the point I'm making is that we had huge economic pressure. There were people fighting in the bush with aspirations who want to feed their children, and the private sector did not come to the party as I thought it would. So if we say Mandela betrayed us, then the question I want to ask you is, did we betray Mandela's dream? Did the private sector come on? Why did we have to bring employment equity? Why did we have to bring all those laws in to force people? We could have had a mentorship program. We could have done this together. So we've all made mistakes. I don't want to sit here with the blame game. Till today, we get resistance. If you look at the number of managers, if you look at the demographics of male, color, have we come to the party, all of us, with all the enthusiasm and verve that we expected? My personal view is we did not pay tribute to Mandela's dream completely. That's my response to whether we betrayed or Mandela betrayed us. The second question, or rather the second part of it is, yes, we did compromise meritocracy. I was MEC in Mpumalanga. I had 4 administrations merged into one. And trust me, I used to speak 4 different languages because the cultures were different. And it is not coincidental that the provinces that struggle the most have had the most homelands within them. Mpumalanga had 4, with all its problems. The other thing that we need to understand is, I think of Trevor Manuel or Tito Mboweni. Trevor Manuel got an engineering diploma and he became one of the foremost ministers of finance. So we had no way of measuring meritocracy as well, because there was organic intellectualism here. And it takes years to develop that meritocratic administration. But I'm not running away from it. Yes, the problem is political patronage is also being played in administrations. To have access to resources, you must be a member of a branch, and then you get deployed into an administration. That is a cancer that's killing us. I'll be very frank with you. And it is time that we stop using those excuses.
Great. Thank you for your frankness. And I agree with you about the issues and the problems of the provinces that had the integration of these different systems, right? Where you had one system that was designed to be efficient and use money efficiently for the purposes that were for service delivery and to really serve the needs of the population we're serving. And you had another system that was designed for patronage, that was designed actually for the money to go, that was going in, to go into the pockets of the officials and not to actually serving the population and integrating those systems as you say, has proven to be incredibly difficult and almost impossible. Is that I think that the idea of the political pressure, and certainly needing to integrate the civil service at the beginning, was very important. I think that what is frustrating for a lot of young people now is that the ANC doesn't seem to have updated or progressed or evolved from that position. So we still are treating appointments of officials as if it were 1994 or 1995, when we really shouldn't be. And I think that, and also where there is a large number of young, qualified people who could be appointed on merit, but who aren't, and who fall through the cracks because they don't have a political connection. So, and I'm sure you're going to get a lot more kind of probing and questioning about that from the fellows in a little while. Okay, I think that, Nkolo,